I stood in the center of my parents' living room, feeling like a ghost in my own home. My mother's face was glowing with a pride I had never seen directed at me. She held a thick, creamy envelope with both hands, the words, "House Deposit," written in her elegant cursive right on the front. With a wide smile, she handed it to my younger sister, Tanya. My heart hammered against my ribs as Tanya squealed and hugged our mom. The room was filled with the sound of happy, shouting and applause from our extended family. It was a scene of pure joy, but for me, it felt like a cold blade to the chest. Just as the clapping died down, my mother turned her eyes toward me. Her expression shifted from warmth to a look of mild annoyance, as if I were a stain on the carpet. She casually reminded me that since I was still staying in the guest room after losing my job, I still owed them rent for the month. The transition was so smooth it made my head spin. One daughter gets a house, the other gets a bill. Everyone continued to cheer as if nothing wrong had been said. Tanya turned to me then, her eyes sparkling with a cold, sharp smirk that chilled my blood. My father let out a loud, booming laugh and patted Tanya on the back. He joked that she had truly earned this gift by being smart with her life and following the right path. He didn't have to say the rest of the sentence for me to hear it. He meant that I had been stupid with mine. I felt the heat rising in my face, a mixture of deep shame and white-hot anger. I tried to speak, to perhaps mention how hard I had worked before my world fell apart, but my mother held up a warning hand. She told me firmly not to ruin this beautiful moment with my usual bitterness. I swallowed my words, the lump in my throat feeling like a jagged stone. I watched as Tanya pulled out a map and showed everyone where her new house was located. She announced with a sugary sweet voice that the place was only 5 minutes away from my old office building. It was a perfect location for her, she said, because the neighborhood was so prestigious. The irony was physically painful. I was the one who had worked in that area for years, and now I was being treated like a stranger to success. Suddenly, Tanya looked directly at me. She asked if I could help her move all her furniture this weekend for free. To understand why this hurts so much, you have to know who I am. My name is Maya, and I have always been the responsible one. Growing up, I never asked for a dime. I worked 2 jobs while going to college and paid every cent of my own tuition. When I started making good money as a senior auditor, I didn't spend it on luxury cars. I quietly sent checks home to help my parents with their mortgage and paid for Tanya's expensive summer camps. I was the silent foundation of this family, never complaining, just doing what needed to be done. I thought my career was set, but everything changed 3 months ago. I was working at a major firm when I discovered a massive gap in the books. My boss, a man named Mr. Henderson, told me to make it disappear. He said it was just a rounding error, but I knew it was fraud. When I refused to sign off on the fake numbers, I was fired the next day for poor performance. I lost everything because I chose to have a conscience. I came home looking for support, but my parents saw my firing as a mark of shame. They didn't care about the truth. Just then, my father mentioned a name that made my skin crawl. Mr. Henderson. My parents began to lecture me again, right there in the middle of Tanya's celebration. They accused me of being arrogant and throwing away a high-paying job over pride. My father said I should have just kept my head down like a normal person. They praised Tanya for being the opposite of me. They said she knew how to keep the peace and build bridges instead of burning them. Tanya sat there nodding, playing the part of the innocent, perfect daughter. She looked like a saint compared to the troublemaker sister who couldn't even keep a job. The mask Tanya was wearing slipped for just a second. She leaned back in her chair and dropped a line about how loyalty to the people who pay you matters more than silly principles. She said that sometimes you have to play the game to get the prize. The way she said it was so specific, so pointed, that it felt like a confession. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a flicker of something dark in her eyes. I realized in that moment that Tanya knew a lot more about my firing and the drama at my old company than she should have. She wasn't just lucky. She was involved. A week later, I was at Tanya's new place, carrying heavy boxes up a flight of stairs. My parents were there too, but they weren't lifting anything. They were busy admiring the brand new stainless steel appliances in the kitchen. My mother bragged about how they had paid for the top-of-the-line models so Tanya wouldn't have to worry about repairs. I felt like a hired hand, sweating and exhausted, while they treated her like a queen. Every time I walked past them, I felt the weight of their judgment. They didn't even offer me a glass of water. Tanya followed me into the guest bedroom as I set down a box of books. She checked her nails and casually asked if I was still unemployed, or if I had finally lowered my standards enough to find work. I felt the sting of her words, but I forced a smile. I lied and told her I was doing just fine and had a few leads I was following. I just wanted her to leave me alone, so I could catch my breath. As I turned to leave the room, I tripped over a small cardboard folder that had fallen out of a box. I froze when I saw the logo on the corner. It was my old boss's company logo. My heart started racing as I looked at that folder. Why would Tanya have a folder from Henderson Financial? I knew her fiancé, Marcus, worked in marketing, but I didn't think he had anything to do with my old firm. I tried to remember what Tanya had told me about his job. She had always been vague, saying he worked for a big consulting group. Now, looking at that logo, a terrifying thought began to take shape in my mind. The house, the money, my firing, it all started to feel like parts of a much larger and much uglier puzzle. I confronted Tanya right then. I pointed to the folder and asked her why. Marcus was holding documents from the office where I was just fired. She didn't even blink. She laughed and said that Henderson Financial was a huge client of Marcus's firm. She insisted it was just a total coincidence and that I was becoming paranoid because of my unfortunate situation. She told me to stop looking for conspiracies and start looking for a paycheck. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling she was lying. Later that night, while the house was quiet, I overheard a phone call from the hallway that proved I was right. I crept closer to the cracked door of Tanya's new home office. I could hear her voice, and she sounded different, colder, and much more confident. She was laughing into her phone, telling the person on the other end not to worry about me. "She's a mess," Tanya said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Mom and Dad will always believe me over her. They think she's a failure, so anything she says just sounds like jealousy." My stomach dropped through the floor. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling over. Tanya continued talking, mentioning Marcus and a bonus they had received for making sure the audit didn't go through. She said the house deposit was basically a thank you gift from the company for managing the family problem. She was talking about me. I was the problem she had managed. My own sister had conspired with my corrupt boss to get me fired so her fiancé could get a promotion and a fat check. They used that blood money to buy this house while I sat in a guest room feeling like a loser. Suddenly, the floorboard creaked under my foot. Tanya stopped talking. She noticed me listening. Tanya burst through the door, her face twisted in a mask of fake outrage. Instead of looking guilty, she started screaming at the top of her lungs. She ran into the living room where our parents were watching TV, crying that I was spying on her and trying to ruin her happiness. She told them I was going through her private files because I was jealous of her new house. My parents stood up instantly, their faces hardening into masks of disappointment. They didn't even ask for my side of the story. To them, I was the bitter failure, and Tanya was the golden child. I tried to tell them what I heard, but they drowned me out. My father told me he was disgusted by my behavior. My mother said that she couldn't have a snake living under her roof anymore. They gave me an ultimatum. I had to get on my knees and apologize to Tanya for my insane lies, or I had to leave their house that very night. I looked at Tanya, who was hiding a smug grin behind her hand. I realized there was no winning here. I didn't say a word. I went upstairs, grabbed my single bag, and walked out into the dark with nothing but my pride. 9. The next few days were a blur of misery. I ended up on a friend's lumpy couch, staring at the ceiling and wondering how my life had turned into a nightmare. I spent my days scrolling through job rejections, my confidence completely shattered. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the sacrifices I had made for my family. I thought about the tuition I paid and the bills I covered, all for people who threw me out the moment I became inconvenient. The sadness was heavy at first, but slowly it began to change. The sadness turned into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just a victim. I was a forensic auditor. I was trained to find the truth in the middle of a lie. If Tanya and Mr. Henderson thought they could just delete me like a bad line of code, they were wrong. I started making a list of everything I knew about the fraud at the firm. I realized I needed proof that tied the company to Tanya's house. Just as I was opening my laptop to start digging, an unexpected notification popped up. I had received an email from my former boss, Mr. Henderson. Tanya burst through the door, her face twisted in a mask of fake outrage. Instead of looking guilty, she started screaming at the top of her lungs. She ran into the living room where our parents were watching TV, crying that I was spying on her and trying to ruin her happiness. She told them I was going through her private files because I was jealous of her new house. My parents stood up instantly, their faces hardening into masks of disappointment. They didn't even ask for my side of the story. To them, I was the bitter failure and Tanya was the golden child. I tried to tell them what I heard, but they drowned me out. My father told me he was disgusted by my behavior. My mother said that she couldn't have a snake living under her roof anymore. They gave me an ultimatum. I had to get on my knees and apologize to Tanya for my insane lies, or I had to leave their house that very night. I looked at Tanya, who was hiding a smug grin behind her hand. I realized there was no winning here. I didn't say a word. I went upstairs, grabbed my single bag, and walked out into the dark with nothing but my pride. The next few days were a blur of misery. I ended up on a friend's lumpy couch, staring at the ceiling and wondering how my life had turned into a nightmare. I spent my days scrolling through job rejections, my confidence completely shattered. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the sacrifices I had made for my family. I thought about the tuition I paid, the bills I covered, all for people who threw me out the moment I became inconvenient. The sadness was heavy at first, but slowly it began to change. The sadness turned into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just a victim. I was a forensic auditor. I was trained to find the truth in the middle of a lie. If Tanya and Mr. Henderson thought they could just delete me like a bad line of code, they were wrong. I started making a list of everything I knew about the fraud at the firm. I realized I needed proof that tied the company to Tanya's house. Just as I was opening my laptop to start digging, an unexpected notification popped up. I had received an email from my former boss, Mr. Henderson. I stared at the screen, my heart thumping. The subject line was, "Private settlement offer." I clicked it with shaking fingers. The email was short and formal. Mr. Henderson was offering me a massive settlement, enough money to live comfortably for years, on one condition. I had to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, NDA. I couldn't talk about my firing, the audit, or anything related to the firm ever again. The amount was suspiciously generous, way more than a standard severance package. It was a shut-up payment, and it was a large one. I sat there for a long time, the glow of the laptop screen lighting up the dark room. A few weeks ago, I would have jumped at this money. It would have solved all my problems and allowed me to move out of my friend's house. But now, the money felt like a trap. If they were willing to pay this much, it meant they were absolutely terrified of what I might find. It meant Tanya's coincidence was definitely a crime. I realized that if I signed that paper, the truth would die forever. I didn't respond to the email. I just closed the laptop. Instead of taking the easy way out, I spent the next morning in a small, cramped office downtown. I was meeting with a lawyer who specialized in employment, law, and corporate whistleblowing. I told him everything: the fraud, the firing, Tanya's fiancé, and the mysterious house deposit. He listened in silence, taking pages of notes. When I showed him the settlement offer from Mr. Henderson, his eyebrows shot up. He told me that my firing violated multiple labor regulations, but more importantly, the settlement offer looked like an admission of guilt. The lawyer leaned back in his chair and looked me straight in the eye. He told me that we could sue for wrongful termination, but if I really wanted to stop them, I needed a smoking gun. He explained that if I could prove that my sister or her fiancé had used internal company information to frame me, the whole house of cards would fall down. He asked me one question that changed everything. "Maya, do you have any physical proof of internal interference? Any messages, any logs, any records that don't belong to the company?" I thought hard, and then I remembered my old laptop, months ago. Before I was fired, Tanya had stayed with me for a weekend. She had complained that her tablet was broken and asked to borrow my personal laptop, too. Print some wedding stuff. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. I was busy with the audit and let her use it for hours. Now, sitting in the lawyer's office, I realized that Tanya wasn't just printing guest lists. I went back to my friend's apartment and pulled my old laptop out of my bag. I started running a deep search on the hard drive, looking for anything hidden. I didn't find much at first, but then I decided to check my cloud backups. I had a program that automatically saved copies of my temporary files. As the folders populated, my breath caught in my throat. I found a series of emails that had been sent during that weekend Tanya stayed with me. They weren't from my account, but they had been forwarded from my inbox to a private address I didn't recognize. Tanya had accessed my work emails while I was in the shower. She had stolen confidential audit notes and sent them to herself. 13. As I read through the stolen emails, the full scale of the betrayal became clear. Tanya hadn't just taken information. She had edited it. She had forwarded my unfinished notes to Mr. Henderson, but she had changed the wording to make it look like I was planning to blackmail the company. She framed me as a greedy liability who was looking for a payoff. In exchange for exposing my supposed plan, Marcus was given a massive promotion and a discretionary bonus. That matched the exact amount of Tanya's house deposit. They had traded my career and my reputation for a kitchen with granite countertops. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I scrolled to the very last email in the thread. It was a message from Mr. Henderson to Tanya's private address. It said, "The transition is complete. Marcus is in. Make sure Maya doesn't get suspicious about the keys." I stared at those words. The keys. At first I thought he meant the house keys, but the way it was phrased felt legal, almost clinical. I knew I had to find out what those keys actually represented. 14. I spent the next 48 hours acting like a detective. I realized that the house wasn't just a gift my parents had helped with. If Tanya and Marcus got the money from a corrupt bonus, there had to be a paper trail. I started looking into the property records for Tanya's new address. Using my skills as a forensic auditor, I dug through the public land registry. I discovered that the house wasn't owned outright by Tanya. It was actually tied to a complex financial agreement involving Marcus's employer and a third-party holding company. The keys Mr. Henderson mentioned weren't just for the front door. In legal terms, key employee housing is a type of benefit that can be reclaimed by a company if certain conditions aren't met. I realized the house was legal leverage. If Marcus didn't keep me quiet, the company could pull the funding. Even worse, I saw that my parents' names were listed on a secondary loan. They hadn't just given Tanya a deposit. They had signed away their retirement savings as a guarantee for a house that was actually controlled by my corrupt former boss. The deeper I dug, the more horrified I became. The house was partially registered under a shell company called Apex Holdings, which I knew was linked to Mr. Henderson's private interests. My parents were completely oblivious. They thought they were helping their favorite daughter buy a home in a prestigious neighborhood. In reality, they had unknowingly invested every penny of their retirement into a high-risk corporate shell game. If the company went under or if Marcus was fired, my parents would lose their house and their savings in one afternoon. I sat in my friend's kitchen, staring at the evidence on my screen. I had enough to destroy Tanya and Mr. Henderson, but doing so would also ruin my parents. They would be penniless. For a moment I hesitated. I thought about the way they had looked at me when they kicked me out, and a part of me felt a dark satisfaction. But then I thought about them being homeless in their 70s, and I knew I couldn't be as cruel as Tanya. I decided not to warn them yet. I needed to get back inside that house to get the final piece of evidence. I decided to play the long game. I called my mother and put on my best broken voice. I told her I was exhausted, sorry for my behavior, and that I missed my family. I told her I realized I was just stressed from the job loss and had taken it out on Tanya. My mother sighed with relief, her voice softening. She told me she knew I would eventually come to my senses. She invited me over for Sunday dinner at Tanya's new house. She said it was time for us to be a whole family again. When I arrived at the house, I was quiet and apologetic. I hugged Tanya, who looked at me with a triumphant, condescending smile. She clearly thought she had won. My parents were thrilled to see me behaving. Throughout dinner, I acted like the perfect defeated daughter. I listened to Tanya brag about her new furniture and Marcus's upcoming business trips. As the night wound down, I casually mentioned that I had left an old pair of expensive headphones in the guest room upstairs. I asked if I could borrow the house keys for a second to go grab them from my car and then let myself back in, so I didn't bother anyone. Tanya was so relaxed and overconfident that she didn't even hesitate. She tossed her keychain onto the counter and told me to be quick. I grabbed the keys and walked out to the driveway. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't go to my car. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took high-resolution photos of every key on the ring. I focused specifically on a small, silver key with a serial number stamped on the side. It was a key to a private deposit box at the firm, the kind of box where executives kept off-the-books documents. I also photographed the legal tag attached to the main house key, which had a barcode and a registration number for the Apex Holdings Group. I had everything now. I walked back inside, handed the keys back to Tanya with a smile, and told them I couldn't find the headphones, but would look again another time. I left shortly after, saying I was tired. As soon as I got into my car, I sent the photos to my lawyer. 10 minutes later, he called me back. He sounded stunned. "Maya," he said, "this confirms it. The house can be frozen by the state as part of a fraud investigation." The next morning, I officially rejected the settlement offer from Mr. Henderson. I didn't just say no. I sent a formal letter to the board of directors and the federal regulators. I included the emails Tanya had stolen and the evidence of the shell company's involvement in the house. I filed a formal whistleblowing complaint that detailed the fraud I had discovered during the audit. It was the financial equivalent of pulling the pin on a grenade and dropping it in the middle of their office. I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. The reaction was instantaneous. Within hours, the regulatory agency contacted the firm. By the afternoon, investigators were on site, seizing computers and freezing accounts. Because the house was registered under the Apex Shell Company, it was immediately flagged as a contested asset. A formal notice was sent to the property, stating that the title was under investigation for being purchased with illicit funds. Marcus was suspended from his job immediately. The public reckoning had begun, and the news started to spread through the industry like wildfire. My phone began to blow up with calls. My parents called me that evening, their voices thick with panic and confusion. They had just received a formal legal letter in the mail. It told them that their gifted house was under a federal investigation, and that they could not sell or move the asset. They were terrified. They demanded to know what was going on, and why I was doing this to the family. They still thought I was the one causing the problem. They accused me of calling the feds out of spite because I was jealous of Tanya's success. I told them I was coming over to explain everything. When I arrived, the atmosphere was chaotic. My mother was crying, and my father was pacing the floor like a caged animal. Tanya was there too, looking pale and frantic, clutching her phone. They all turned on me the moment I walked through the door. My father started shouting, asking how I could be so cruel to my own sister. I stood my ground, pulled out a thick folder of my own, and laid it on the coffee table. I told them it was time they learned the truth about their golden child. I walked them through every single piece of evidence. I showed them the stolen emails where Tanya framed me. I showed them the proof that Marcus's bonus was a bribe for his silence. I showed them the legal documents proving that their retirement money was now tied to a criminal investigation because of the Shell Company Tanya had used. My parents sat in stunned silence as the image of their perfect daughter crumbled before their eyes. They looked at Tanya, waiting for her to deny it, but she couldn't. Tanya finally snapped. She stopped crying and started screaming at me, her face red with rage. She screamed that I was destroying the family and that I was a bitter loser who couldn't handle someone else having more than me. For the first time, my parents saw her true colors. They saw the cruelty and the greed that had been hidden behind her sweet smiles. In her heat of her rage, she slipped. She shouted, "I worked hard to set that up. I deserved that house for getting you out of our lives." The room went silent. She had admitted it all. The fallout was total. Without the company's protection, Marcus was officially fired for his involvement in the fraud. Because the house was tied to the investigation, the bank moved to seize the property. The house deposit my parents had given Tanya was gone, swallowed up by legal fees and the frozen Shell Company. My parents were facing the very real possibility of losing their own home because they had used it as collateral for Tanya's mortgage. The golden child had brought the entire family to the edge of ruin. Tanya's fiancé left her a week later, realizing that she was a liability to his future. The house deal collapsed completely, and Tanya was forced to pack her things and move into a tiny, cheap apartment. My parents were broken. They sat in their living room, surrounded by the silence of a house that now felt too big and too empty. One evening, my mother called me. Her voice was small and shaking. She didn't demand anything this time. She simply asked if I could come over because they didn't know what to do next. She asked for my help. I went to see them, but I didn't go as the responsible daughter who would fix everything for free. I sat them down and told them I would help them save their home, that things were going to be different. I demanded total transparency in our relationship. I told them there would be no more favoritism and no more treating me like a second-class citizen. I set firm boundaries. I would manage their finances to get their retirement back on track, but they had to admit publicly and to our relatives that they were wrong about me. My parents hesitated. It was hard for them to swallow their pride and admit they had been fooled by Tanya. My father looked at the floor, and my mother gripped her handkerchief. But then they looked at the legal bills on the table and the threat of foreclosure. They realized that the only person who could save them was the daughter they had cast aside. They nodded. They agreed to my terms. It wasn't a warm hug or a tearful apology, but it was a start. It was the first time I felt like an equal in my own family. The investigation into Henderson Financial concluded a few months later. The company was forced to pay a massive public settlement, and Mr. Henderson was barred from the industry for life. Because I had acted as the primary whistleblower, the government awarded me a significant compensation package. My reputation in the industry was restored, and I received multiple job offers from firms that valued my integrity. I didn't gloat about it. I just went back to work, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I used some of my compensation to clear the debt on my parents' house, ensuring they wouldn't be homeless. I did it because I'm not Tanya. I don't believe in leaving people behind. Tanya, however, was left to face the consequences of her choices. She moved out of the city, alone and struggling to find a job with a tarnished name. She had tried to build a life on a foundation of lies, and it had inevitably sunk. I didn't feel happy about her suffering, but I finally felt like justice had been served. I finally moved into a beautiful place of my own, paid for with my own hard-earned money. It wasn't a gift or a bribe. It was a reward for my resilience. My parents ended up downsizing to a smaller, more manageable condo, and they started living a quieter life. Our relationship is still a work in progress, but the dynamic has permanently changed. They no longer lecture me about my pride. Instead, they ask for my advice. They finally see me for who I am. A few days ago, Tanya tried to contact me. She sent a long, rambling message asking for money, and claiming she was the real victim in all of this. She said she was family, and that I owed it to her to help her out of her bad luck. I read the message while sitting in my new living room, looking out at the city skyline. I thought about the house keys she had tossed to me that night, thinking she was the one in control. I realized that she still hadn't learned anything. I didn't answer her message. I didn't feel the need to argue or explain myself anymore. I simply deleted the text and put my phone away. I stood up and walked to my front door, checking the lock. I turned the key my own key to my own life. The real victory wasn't the money I won or the house I saved. It wasn't even seeing Tanya lose. The real victory was reclaiming my voice and realizing that I never needed their approval to be successful. I walked away with my dignity, knowing that I am the architect of my own future. I stood on my balcony, feeling the cool evening air. I realized that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to stand up to the people who are supposed to love you the most. But when you do, you find a strength you never knew you had. My family story started with an injustice, but it ended with the truth. I am Maya, and I am no longer a ghost in anyone's home. I am the woman who stood her ground, and for the first time in my life, I am finally home. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share.